Hello and welcome to Business Standard. Here's a glimpse of the views expressed on the web pages of Business Standard this week. In his weekly column National Interest, Shekhar Gupta says India must break the two-front border threat with China and Pakistan. But how to do it is the big question. Gupta says we need to settle our issues with one of the two. That's why all our earlier governments made serious moves to make peace with China. But it's more logical to settle your problems with a country that's weaker than you, that has more to gain from peace. That hasn't worked, and now there's another problem. The Modi government is our most political of all. In a sense, it weighs all policy in electoral terms. In that case, it would need hostility with Pakistan to persist, because Pakistan and pan-Islamic terrorism do help in creating electoral polarization. That is the fundamental issue that the Modi government will need to weigh. Will it let domestic political compulsions limit its strategic options, or have the confidence to change? Gupta writes. In his weekly column for the Business Standard, TN Nayan writes that there still remains a disconnect between the government's new business stance and the earlier push to dictate the narrative in politics and public life. Nayan writes that with the rediscovery of the forgotten saying that the government had no business being in business, privatization and the proposed monetization of government assets have emerged from a fiscal dead end. But he says that since market-oriented economies seeking private investment don't function very well without autonomous institutions and freedom of speech, the government would find it hard to argue that this is what it has been promoting. Nayan says taking a leaf out of Beijing's book will not work. In his weekly column for Business Standard, Mahesh Vyas says the Indian economy made good progress in bringing jobs back in January this year. Nearly 12 million more people found work in the month compared to December last year. Vyas says this is big because month-on-month changes in employment rarely crossed the 5 million mark before the lockdown. Also, during the lockdown, after the initial months of a sharp fall and rise in employment, recovery had slowed down and then stalled even before it was complete. Employment fell in each of the 3 months from October to December. So the recovery in January this year is a welcome relief, Vyas says. The report of the 15th Finance Commission is comprehensive and analytically rich, writes Ratin Roy in a column for Business Standard. The report does a decent job of acknowledging the impact of the pandemic and the prior structural growth slowdown by projecting cautious recovery in nominal GDP growth to 11.5% in the fiscal year 2026. Roy says his only quibble is with the historic analysis. The report asserts that the central government secured fiscal consolidation when in fact the data it presents shows that governments have consistently missed their fiscal deficit targets. It also fails to acknowledge explicitly that the fiscal stress on the state governments has been caused by central interventions and the unacceptable resort to cesses. But overall, the report is welcome at a time when there's little economic analysis coming from the central government that's of good quality, writes Roy. In a column for Business Standard, Veer Sanghvi says it does not make sense for the government to continue with an anti-national or Khalistani or sedition narrative to tackle the farmer protests. Sanghvi says anger, abuse and repression will not help this government on this issue, but magnanimity might. If Prime Minister Modi were to announce that he will repeal the laws and put together a collegium of farmers, opposition figures and ruling party legislators with experience of agriculture to draft new laws, he would leave the protesters with nothing to complain about. Given that he has already put the laws in cold storage, it would make no material difference to agriculture either. When things go wrong, don't blame the rest of the world for your problems, instead try and resolve the original issue. Repression is rarely the answer, try statesmanship instead, Sanghvi writes. Business Standard in an editorial says the resumption of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code to resolve stressed assets should be welcomed. But the editorial also says the government's plan to set up an asset reconstruction company and an asset management company to also resolve stressed assets looks good on paper but is unlikely to work on the ground. For instance, banks are expected to bring in capital and it's not clear why banks will put in money in a new entity only to take part of it back while transferring assets. What the government should do instead is to strengthen the IBC by increasing the tribunal strength, among other things. In short, setting up a parallel institutional mechanism will only help in kicking the can down the road, the editorial says. Union Health Minister Harsh Vardhan's decision to hold off on bringing vaccines to the private market is a mistake and will hold back the control of the pandemic as well as the country's return to normal economic functioning Business Standard writes in an editorial. Vardhan's reasons have little logical foundation, the editorial says. He argued that if the government managed the vaccine rollout, then there would be less worry about some wrong product reaching the market. If this is a complaint about the quality of the vaccines, then it is hard to see how whether it's a private or public vaccine makes any difference. Certainly, questions about the indemnification of vaccine companies are important, but unless the government plans to not have private sector sales at all, there's no reason to decide on that issue later when it should be done now, the editorial says. Business Standard in an editorial says it's important to recognize that privatization at scale would not be easy, particularly in the case of public sector banks. In this context, aside from dealing with the political opposition and legal issues, the government will need a clear roadmap. Many have advocated that the government should privatize the bigger public sector banks first to make a greater impact and show its determination to give a big push to privatization, but that might boomerang because of stiff resistance from trade unions and political parties. Starting with relatively small banks is therefore a good idea because it will help test the waters. The government must also show some urgency and should start early in the next fiscal year because the process is likely to be time consuming, the editorial says. The arrest of 21-year-old climate activist Disha Rabi for editing a toolkit linked to the farmers' protest highlights one of the ironies of the current political climate, Business Standard writes in an editorial. The irony is that a draconian colonial-era law that was used to stifle dissent against an imperial government is being applied with increasing frequency in a country where a party returned to parliament for a second term with a bigger majority. Ravi's case is symptomatic of several others who've been arrested for sedition. But on Tuesday, a courageous additional session judge in Delhi granted bail to two other activists connected with the farmers' protest. He said that the sedition laws can't be used to quieten dissent. That is a clear reminder to the government that India is a democracy where peaceful dissent, comment, and protest remain fundamental rights, the editorial says. The move to open up the Indian geospatial information sector, allowing accurate digital mapping, is an important reform, Business Standard writes in an editorial. There are many advantages of geospatial mapping. It can allow enormous cost and time savings. Street View helps in efficient municipal tax collection as well as enabling services like Zomato and Uber. It will also be possible to track the spread of epidemic diseases, monitor environmental indicators such as deforestation or afforestation, design better sewage disposal networks, power cabling networks, and irrigation systems. Much of the work may involve the use of drones, which is why a less restrictive drone policy is needed. Mapping at such accurate levels can lead to massive privacy violations because the location of individuals is pinpointed. This is yet another reason why legislation protecting private data is urgently needed, the editorial says. While it's true that defense spending needs to be increased, it should be part of the normal budgeting process of the Ministry of Finance and not done through the Finance Commission, writes Business Standard in an editorial. If the defense budget is at historic lows, this is because the government has not been able to improve revenue collection over the years. As a consequence, the Commission has penalized the primary engines of development spending in India, the state governments. This is not a lasting solution, and the government needs to focus on improving tax collection as a percentage of gross domestic product to fulfill its obligations, the editorial says.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.